Imagine a man sitting alone in a dimly lit room, surrounded by stacks of books and papers. His name is John Calvin, and he is not just any man, he's one of the most influential figures in the history of Christianity. But despite his towering reputation, Calvin often found himself torn between his fear of being seen as presumptuous and his deep conviction that his work was necessary. This struggle is a recurring theme in his life, and it all starts with the pressure of his friends. In 1556, Calvin wrote a preface to his lectures on the book of Hosea. He claimed that his works were only published because of the persistent and urgent requests of those around him. He said, "I can truly and honestly say and even prove through trustworthy witnesses that the works I have published were almost torn from my hands by the constant requests of my friends." It's a common theme among writers, using the pressure from friends to explain why they write. Calvin used it too, even as a young man, to justify his literary ambitions. Calvin's early works show this pattern. In a letter defending his friend, he wrote that the work was not meant for publication. When he wrote De Clementia, he criticized those who wrote just to be published, calling their desire unhealthy and excessive. Yet, it was the advice of his friends that pushed him to publish. The same thing happened with Psychopannychia, a work on the state of the soul after death. It's hard to know if Calvin was always sincere, especially when he published De Clementia at his own expense. From the 1540s onward, Calvin's letters show that some of his writing was indeed requested by friends. His first major work, The Institutes of the Christian Religion, was a personal project, but his circle had high expectations. Calvin's intention was to clarify the foundations of the faith and refute false accusations. When he revised the work, he planned a comprehensive program, with the Institutes as the key to understanding his biblical commentaries. His friend Operinus encouraged him to republish the Institutes in 1537. As Calvin's work in Geneva became more demanding, his friend Farel pushed him to write more often, expressing impatience. The preface to the final version of the Institutes in 1559 shows how Calvin balanced his concerns. He was surprised by the success of his book and felt obligated to improve it for his readers. He wrote, "Over time, I realized it was received much better than I could have hoped, and I felt all the more obliged to work better and more fully for those who receive my doctrine so gladly." Calvin's reasons for writing the Traité de la Seine, his first treatise in French, included the pressure from friends. He said, "Several good men who saw the need for it asked me to write." The Breve Instruction contre les Anabaptistes was also requested by readers who insistently asked for it. Calvin was confident in the value of his exegetical work and promised to dedicate his life to it. He wrote, "If I have sufficient time and freedom, I have decided to devote myself mainly to this work. Even if my post leaves me with very little time, I have decided to dedicate it to this kind of writing." Many of Calvin's works in Strasbourg were written in response to requests. For example, the letter to Sadoleto was written at the request of the citizens of Geneva, and the pamphlets on the Diet of Regensburg and the council called by Paul III were likely requested by Bucer. In 1543, Bucer encouraged Calvin to write about the Diet of Speyer. Throughout the 1540s, Weyrit and Farel pushed Calvin to engage in various controversies. Calvin's mastery of polemics made him the go-to person for responses. Farel's request for a refutation of the Anabaptists is a good example. Farel acknowledged Calvin's busy schedule but still asked for his help. Calvin's international reputation grew, and he received requests from all over. The 1552 pamphlet on predestination was a response to the Italian Brethren, and the call to rebut Dirk Coornhert's tract came from the Netherlands. The Polish Calvinists also turned to Calvin and Bullinger for help. At the heart of Calvin's work was his sense of duty. He wrote to help his readers and fulfill his calling as a reformer. In the Traité de la Say, he said, I thought it would be very useful to deal briefly with and clearly explain the sum total of what one should know about the Lord's Supper. In his lectures on Jeremiah, he wrote, I never would have authorized the publication of this book had I not been sure of its usefulness and fruitfulness for the church. Calvin's calling was not just a personal mission, it was a divine one, he wrote. Since God wanted me to be one of those through whose work the world has received a pure doctrine of the gospel. His exile from Geneva made him doubt his calling, but he quickly recovered. He wrote to Farel, though I have no reason to complain because of my own affairs, but because I think that an earlier completion date is in the public good, I cannot help but be greatly troubled. Calvin's work as a reformer was driven by a deep sense of duty and a gift from God. He believed that most Christians needed help to understand the Scriptures, and he did not shy away from proclaiming his talent. He wrote, I am not ashamed to recognize what God gave me in terms of understanding Scripture, since it is true. It is nothing else than a way to find glory in Him. Writing for Calvin was not just a rational decision. It was a response to the pressures of friendship, the needs of his readers, and the call of God. His sensitivity and strong sense of duty shaped his work, making him one of the most influential figures in Christian history. Calvin, the famous reformer, often found himself in tricky situations when it came to writing. Sometimes he didn't want to write at all, and other times he felt overwhelmed by the tasks at hand. One such instance was when Martin Bucer asked Calvin to write something against an upcoming diet, Inspire. Calvin wasn't excited about it. He wrote to his friend Pierre Viret, I will do as Bucer wishes, but it will be very difficult. The next day, Calvin confided in William Furrow, I have already started and made a little progress, but believe me, I will not advance without great difficulty. Despite his reluctance, the work was published a month later. When it came to criticizing the Council of Trent, Calvin was more cautious. He told Viret, I will shortly attack the Tridentine Fathers, since so many people from all over are asking me to, if the first part goes well. I will continue, however, I cannot promise anything. Calvin felt drained, saying, I am so overwhelmed by writing and worries that I am almost tired of life. He added, I will add a corollary to your work as soon as I catch my breath. In August 1546, Calvin was working on a book called De Scandalis, but he was upset because he lost his manuscript on 2 Corinthians. When he found it again, he tried to write, but the style wasn't flowing as he wanted. He put the book aside, saying, the style is not flowing the way I wanted. Calvin also faced challenges with his commentaries. In 1550, he started writing commentaries on the Acts of the Apostles and Genesis. He told Farel, I am embarrassed to admit how slowly I am making progress in Acts, and I think it will be a long work based on the first third that I have completed. His disagreement with François Baudouin, a former student, was especially tough. Calvin said, I would like to deal with this rascal as he deserves, but I am drowning in private correspondence, and even if I still had a bit of energy left, it has weakened. Despite his reluctance, Calvin eventually wrote a response and announced to Theodore Beza, it was only small consolation for my labors, but this rascal's hateful audacity had to be refuted. Interestingly, Calvin often described himself as lazy. In 1534, he wrote to his friend François Daniel, "I feel well, and am making some progress in my work as far as I can, given my laziness that you know about." Even in 1546, he told Jacques de Bourgogne, "As well as the sermons and lectures, I have not done much for about a month, so much so that I am almost ashamed to live in this useless fashion." Calvin's approach to polemics, or debates, was complex. He knew that sometimes writing a pamphlet could do more harm than good. In 1535, his friend Wolfgang Capito advised against publishing Psychopannychia because attacking errors only makes them better known. Calvin waited before writing against the spiritual libertines, hoping silence would be effective against this disease. However, Calvin felt compelled to respond when attacked. In 1538, he published his Latin Catechism to refute accusations of Arianism. When Pius challenged him in 1542, Calvin felt he had to respond, "He is attacking me by name and is looking for an opponent." Calvin wrote quickly to take him down a peg and to awaken and encourage all good and faithful people. In 1556, Calvin responded to Antoine Cathelin, a critic who had attacked him. Calvin wrote, "I admit that in his folly he has at least achieved this result, namely, to get me to reply to his tall tales." Despite his reluctance, Calvin felt he had to respond to protect his reputation and the faith. Calvin's polemical style was often harsh, and his friend Theodore Beza defended him, calling it truly prophetic vehemence. Calvin himself tried to balance respect and firmness. In 1534, he wrote, "I will engage in disputations without malice and without targeting specific individuals." But 2 years later, he admitted, "I noticed at the heart of the matter a few things that were said a bit sharply, or even harshly." Calvin believed that some people could be brought back to the right path, while others deserved harsher treatment. Calvin's goal was to expose the truth and highlight the dividing line between those who accepted it and those who rejected it. He wanted to unmask the impostors and show the absolute proof of the truth. This approach defined his polemical works and his legacy as a reformer. Calvin the Reformer saw himself as a shepherd protecting his flock from wolves. His strong words against those he saw as enemies of the faith were aimed at comforting his followers and maybe even convincing some of his opponent's supporters. For example, when he wrote about the execution of Servetus, he had two goals: to stop people from spreading lies about him and his beliefs, and to prevent the ignorant from speaking against him and his followers. However, Calvin's strong words and personal attacks often caused trouble. In 1548, his opponents in Geneva complained about the insults in his pamphlets. The authorities examined one of his works and said it was important, but they also noted that some of the words were too harsh and could be removed. The decision to execute Servetus was a significant event. Calvin wrote a defense of this action, explaining why he believed it was right to punish heretics. His friend Nicolaus Lerkinden in Bern, taught Calvin, should have published this defense in the name of the Genevan Council, not as his own work. Sir Kinden worried that Calvin's direct approach might not win over peaceful people. Another friend, Wolfgang Musculus, feared that the title of the book might turn readers away if they thought it was too violent. When Calvin wrote against Joachim Westphal, a German theologian, even his closest supporters were concerned. His friend Weyrith tried to help by writing a response, but it didn't work. Calvin told Bullinger that he was careful not to offend anyone important. But Bullinger still criticized the violence in Calvin's words. Calvin tried to tone down his next response, but he admitted that he sometimes got more heated than he intended. Calvin's approach to polemics was complex. He believed strongly in his mission to defend the truth, but he also had a passionate temperament that often led him to harsh words. In his farewell speech to the Genevan pastors, he said he never wrote out of hate, but always to glorify God. This statement shows that he thought some opponents were so stubborn that they deserved strong criticism. Calvin's friends often tried to get him to be more gentle. For example, Farel advised him to avoid personal attacks and to focus on the issues, not the individuals. Calvin sometimes agreed to be more restrained, but he often found it difficult. He felt that some of his opponents were so unreasonable that they deserved harsh words. Despite his strong words, Calvin was often surprised and hurt when his opponents responded in kind. He saw himself as an innocent victim of their malice and envy. He wrote that he was one of the most attacked and slandered people on earth. For Calvin, his cause was always right, and his opponents were in the wrong. Calvin didn't always respond to every request to write against his opponents. Sometimes he hesitated and even refused. For example, he didn't want to write against the libertines again, even though his friends asked him to. He felt that his previous work on the subject was enough. Similarly, he was reluctant to write against some of his other opponents, like Poquet and Servetus, because he thought it was a waste of time. However, Calvin's friends often convinced him to write. Bullinger, for example, kept asking Calvin to respond to various opponents, and sometimes Calvin gave in. But he often felt that he was being pulled into endless debates that he would rather avoid. Calvin's relationships with his friends and colleagues show the complexity of his character. He was a passionate and sometimes harsh polemicist, but he was also deeply committed to his faith and his mission. His friends respected his skills, but often wished he would be more gentle. Calvin's life and work reflect the tensions and challenges of being a reformer in a time of great religious and political turmoil. Calvin often chose to avoid getting into arguments, even when he was attacked. One example of this is seen in his final words in his response to Antoine Cathalin. He wrote, "If that dandy continues to chatter impudently, I could easily leave him aside with other beasts worth 100 times more than him. It is not my task to silence all the barking dogs of the world." This shows that Calvin believed it was more important to focus on his work rather than waste time on endless debates. Despite his strong words, Calvin sometimes tried to calm down the arguments between Protestants. He called the people who tried to make peace compromisers, but in a funny way, because he himself tried to do the same thing. Calvin was upset by the deep divisions among Protestants, especially over the Lord's Supper. He wanted to find a way to bring people together without giving up important beliefs. In 1533, Calvin was shocked by how divided the Protestant church was. He quickly tried to find a middle ground, preferring Luther's ideas but not agreeing with everything Luther said. He wrote in 1536 that he was sad about the horrible dissensions that split Protestants. In 1541, he published a book called Petit Traité de la Scène, a small treatise on the Eucharist, where he criticized both sides for not listening to each other. He said they should focus on what they had in common and work together. In 1539, Calvin was worried that his earlier writings might be seen as a critique of Luther. He added a note to his commentary on Romans, saying he didn't want to cause more arguments. He promised to try to agree as much as possible with the German churches. When arguments broke out again between Zurich and Wittenberg, Calvin tried to calm things down. He wrote to Bullinger, saying that even though Luther could be harsh, he had done a lot of good for the church. Calvin thought that people were too quick to criticize Luther because of the praise he received. Calvin also wrote a preface for a book by Melanchthon, a famous German theologian. He praised Melanchthon's work, but pointed out a few areas where he had some reservations. He said that Melanchthon didn't always go into deep details, but that was okay because the book was meant to teach and not to argue. Calvin encouraged readers to be patient and not to reject the book just because of a few things they didn't like. Calvin believed that the divisions among Protestants were a big problem. He wrote about this in his book, Des Scandales, on scandals, saying that it could turn people away from the truth. He even made peace with Bullinger, even though he had disagreed with Zwingli before. Calvin tried to work with Melanchthon to show that they agreed on the Lord's Supper. Calvin signed the Augsburg Confession, a statement of Protestant beliefs, and never changed his mind about it. He wanted to keep the Protestant churches united, even if they didn't agree on everything. However, when it came to people like Westphal, who was a member of a large Protestant church but disagreed strongly with Calvin, he became more aggressive. Calvin felt that Westphal and his friends were no longer brothers in the faith and needed to be exposed. Calvin's friends often asked him to write polemical works or arguments against their opponents. He was known for being concise and effective. For example, in 1543, Pierre Viret was asked to write a response to the Articles of the Sorbonne, but Calvin ended up doing it because he was faster and better at it. Calvin found a great polemicist in Theodore Beza. Beza wrote a book in 1549 that defended Calvin against attacks. Calvin liked Beza's style, which was more satirical than his own. In 1553, Beza wrote a funny letter mocking Pierre Lisette, a critic of Calvin. Calvin sent this letter to his friend Lauer, saying it would make him laugh. Calvin was sensitive to what his readers thought. When Farel praised his Acta Synodi Tridentini, Acts of the Council of Trent, Calvin said he started to like it more. He also welcomed the praise of a German reader in 1552, saying it gave him courage to keep writing. Calvin often sought support from other pastors when he was involved in big debates. For example, in 1545, he asked Luther and Melanchthon to support his views on the Nicodemuites, a group of Protestants he strongly disagreed with. He also worked with Bullinger to defend the Consensus Tigurinus, a statement of beliefs agreed upon by Calvin and the Zurich pastors. When Calvin wrote about predestination in the case of Servetus, he included letters from other Geneva pastors to show they agreed with him. He also built up cases against his opponents by gathering documents and letters. For example, in his battle against Valentino Gentile, he included documents from Gentile's trial in Geneva. Calvin's friends often gave him advice on his writing. His first religious work, Psychopenachia, was read by Capito, who suggested changes. Robert Olivetan also had a copy and shared it with Christophe Fabry. Bucer, another friend, initially discouraged Calvin from publishing it, but later changed his mind. This shows that Calvin was open to feedback and willing to listen to his more experienced friends. John Calvin, a central figure in the Protestant Reformation, often sought advice from his friends and colleagues before publishing his works. This was especially true for his polemical writings, where he felt the need to ensure that his arguments were strong and well received by his supporters. One example of this was when Calvin considered adding a section to his commentary on the Epistle to the Romans to address concerns raised by Martin Luther about the Lord's Supper. However, after taking advice from Philip Melanchthon, Calvin decided to omit the passage. Instead, he included it in a later edition of his Institutes of the Christian Religion in 1543. Calvin also reached out to his friends for feedback on his writings. For instance, he sent a draft of his work against the Anabaptists to the ministers of Neuchâtel, but it seems that the full text did not reach them. His friend William Farel was eager to read it and expressed disappointment when he didn't receive the entire manuscript. When Calvin wrote a pamphlet against his opponent Caroli, he sent a draft to his friend Pierre Viret for comments. Viret's cautious feedback upset Calvin, who preferred more direct criticism. Calvin believed that Viret was too gentle, as if trying to protect his feelings. In 1541, Calvin wrote a catechism very quickly and didn't have time to show it to Viret, even though they were working together in Geneva. Later, in his farewell speech to the pastors, Calvin explained why he hadn't shared it. Calvin frequently sought the opinions of his close friend William Farel. For example, he sent Farel the first drafts of his commentary on Genesis, asking for feedback. Calvin valued Farel's input and wanted to make sure his work was as good as it could be. In 1551, Calvin wrote a dedicatory letter for his commentary on the canonical epistles, which he used to criticize the Council of Trent. He sent a copy to Pier Paolo Vergerio, who shared it with Heinrich Bullinger. Bullinger only saw the letter before the commentary was published, but he was pleased with it. When Calvin needed to write a response to Westphal, he consulted his colleagues in Zurich. He sent a draft to Bullinger and other Zurich clergy, who provided detailed comments. Calvin took some of their advice, but not all. He also consulted Farel and the churches in Bern and Basel, though he was critical of Ambrosius Blauer for sharing the draft too widely. Calvin sent an amended version of his work to Farel and others, including Peter Martyr Vermigli in Strasbourg. He noted that he hadn't always followed the advice from Zurich, but hoped to have appeased his colleagues. The work was published in early 1555, but without the explicit support of the Swiss churches. Calvin's approach to sharing his work changed over time. After receiving lengthy critiques from Zurich, he decided to send his writings to friends only after they were nearly complete. For example, when he wrote his Ultima Admonitio ad J. Westphalem in 1557, he sent the printed sheets to Bullinger and Beza, who were in Lausanne. However, Calvin was more open to sharing drafts with trusted friends like Theodore Beza. For instance, he gave Beza the only manuscript copy of his work, De Aeterna de Praedetomate, against Bolsec. Beza's feedback was detailed and critical, suggesting improvements to the text. Calvin also sought Beza's input on his refutation of a work by Castellio. Calvin's colleagues, who visited his home in Geneva, often had access to his writings while he was working on them. One of his friends, de Galars, noted that Calvin worked on his commentary on the Psalms even when he was in bed due to poor health. In 1561, when Calvin decided to write a new work against François Baudouin, Beza was in France. They exchanged letters about the pamphlet, but Calvin only sent the text for Beza's information, not for comments, because the printing was already underway. Calvin's writing was driven by both rational and emotional motivations. His exegetical commentaries were part of a long-term project, while his polemical writings often emerged from specific events. He felt a strong sense of duty to speak the truth and expose lies, even if it meant offending his opponents. Calvin's friends and colleagues played a crucial role in supporting and shaping his work, providing encouragement and valuable feedback. Calvin's choice of language also reflected his intended audience. He wrote in Latin for a scholarly audience and in French for a broader readership. Early in his career, he wrote in Latin, even for works intended to help the less educated. However, as the use of French became more accepted, Calvin increasingly wrote in French, especially for works aimed at his compatriots. Calvin's mastery of both Latin and French was evident in his correspondence. He preferred to write in Latin even to French-speaking friends like Farel and Viret, unless practical considerations required French. For example, he once wrote a letter in French because he was dictating it from his bed and had no Latin-speaking secretary available. Calvin's use of Latin was natural for scholarly works, but he also used it for polemical writings aimed at German theologians. Despite his initial plan to write his commentary on the Psalms in French, he found himself using Latin when he began the work, showing the strong influence of his humanist education. Calvin's choice of language and his approach to writing reflect his deep commitment to his vocation and his desire to communicate effectively with different audiences. His willingness to seek feedback and his sensitivity to the reactions of his friends and colleagues highlight the climacteric nature of his work. Calvin's interest in spreading his teachings to a wider audience, both within France and internationally, led him to translate his works into multiple languages. His early writings were often in French, the vernacular of his native country, which allowed him to reach a broader, less educated audience. However, Calvin also recognized the importance of Latin, the language of the educated and the scholarly, to ensure his ideas reached the broader European community. Calvin's works, such as the Petit Traité de la Seine, a short treatise on the Eucharist, were initially written in French and later translated into Latin. The French version was designed to be simple and accessible to the ignorant and unlearned, while the Latin version aimed at the educated and scholarly. This dual approach allowed Calvin to address both the common people and the intellectual elite. One of Calvin's significant early works in French was the preface he wrote for the New Testament in the Olivetan Bible. Even though this preface was a short text, it had a symbolic value, as it was one of the first times Calvin wrote in the vernacular. However, he also included a fictitious privilege in Latin, calling for the right to publish the Bible in French, touting his humanist training and his commitment to both languages. Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion underwent several revisions, and he translated it into French to make it accessible to a wider audience. His Catechism of 1537 was another example of his efforts to provide simple, clear teachings to the uneducated. He wrote the first version in Latin, and then translated it into French, emphasizing the importance of reaching those who could not read Latin. During his stay in Strasbourg, Calvin became increasingly involved in translating and writing in French. He translated works by other reformers such as Melanchthon's response to Charles V into French to make them accessible to the emperor, who was not fluent in Latin or German. Calvin also worked on translating the reports from important religious meetings, like the Diet of Regensburg, to keep his French-speaking compatriots informed. Upon returning to Geneva, Calvin continued to write in French, especially for works with a large target audience. The Forme des prières ecclésiastiques, form of church prayers, and the Catechisme were written in French to serve as liturgical and educational guides. Calvin also wrote polemical works in French to teach and warn against heresies, such as those of the Anabaptists and the Libertines, addressing the poor faithful who are untaught and illiterate. Calvin's preface to Melanchthon's Loci Communes clearly explains his views on the different audiences for Latin and French texts. He noted that while Melanchthon was well known among scholars, he was less recognized by the French-speaking people who had little schooling. This highlights the divide between the educated and the uneducated, which Calvin aimed to bridge through his translations and writings. Calvin's later works, such as his commentaries on the Pentateuch, were translated into French to make them accessible to the faithful. He enjoyed the process of translating and revising these texts, finding it both a way to correct errors and to make the content more understandable. Calvin's colleagues, such as Farel and Melanchthon, often praised his ability to write concisely and clearly. Farel, in particular, was impressed by Calvin's skill in dealing with complex biblical topics in a straightforward manner. This ability to write with requisite brevity and clarity was a hallmark of Calvin's style, making his works both accessible and influential. Calvin's approach to language and translation was driven by his pastoral concern for the uneducated and his desire to spread his teachings internationally. By using both French and Latin, he effectively reached a diverse audience, ensuring that his ideas were accessible to all, from the common people to the scholarly elite. Calvin was known for his simple and clear writing style, which set him apart from many of his friends and contemporaries. His preference for brevity wasn't just a personal choice. It was a principle he applied to his work as a theologian and writer. One of Calvin's closest friends, William Farel, often asked for Calvin's opinion on his writings. In 1549, Farel had written a book called The Glaive de la Parole Véritable, the Sword of the True Word. Farel was eager for Calvin's thoughts, but Calvin found it hard to give his honest opinion. Eventually, Calvin had to be honest. He wrote to Farel, "I admire St. Augustine, but I don't like his long and detailed writing. My own style might seem dry, but I prefer to be clear and concise. I noticed some brilliant parts in your book, but the long and heavy style might make it hard for readers to appreciate them fully." Calvin also rejected the idea of working with his friend Pierre Viret, because Viret's writing was too wordy. In his early work, a commentary on the Book of Romans, Calvin emphasized the importance of being brief. He believed that a good writer should love brevity, even if others preferred more detailed explanations. Calvin's commitment to clarity and simplicity also brought him close to Philip Melanchthon, a leading figure in the Reformation. Calvin dedicated one of his works to Melanchthon, praising his straightforward and clear style. Calvin wrote, "I try to be simple and direct in my writing, just like you. I want to present ideas clearly without hiding them in complicated words." When a friend named Enzines asked Calvin to review a letter, Calvin made many edits. He explained, "I removed some parts not because I disagreed with them, but because they were unnecessary or didn't add much to the message." Even as he grew older, Calvin tried to keep his writing concise. In his commentary on the book of Joshua, he wrote, "My friends encouraged me to write this commentary, and I'm trying to be as brief as possible, but it's taking longer than I expected." Despite his efforts, not everyone appreciated Calvin's style. Some 16th century writers believed that brevity could lead to confusion. Pierre Fabry, a French writer, said that if a text was too short and hard to understand, it should be expanded. When Calvin revised his commentaries, he sometimes added more details to make them clearer. One of Calvin's critics, Heinrich Bullinger, thought that Calvin's book Against Servetus was too brief and hard to follow. Calvin admitted that he wrote it quickly and deliberately kept it short, but he believed that brevity was necessary for clarity. Calvin's writing was not only clear and concise, but also quick. He could write long letters and responses in just a few days. For example, his response to Sadoleto, a 65-page letter, was written in just 6 days. He joked to a friend that it took him less time to write than it did for someone else to translate it. Calvin's ability to write quickly and clearly was partly due to his excellent memory. He could remember past events and pick up where he left off in his writing even after long breaks. When he preached or taught, he rarely used notes and could recall details from many years ago. Most of Calvin's works were commentaries on the Bible. He followed the text closely, line by line, and explained it in a way that was easy to understand. He believed that the literal meaning of the text was the most important, a view that was different from the medieval approach of looking for multiple layers of meaning. When Calvin wrote responses to his critics, he often included the original text to show exactly what he was responding to. This helped readers understand the context and see that his criticisms were fair. However, this method sometimes made his writing follow the structure of his opponent's work, which could be limiting. Calvin's unique style combined brevity, clarity, and depth. He was skilled in both Latin and French and could express complex ideas in a straightforward way. His writing was not just a reflection of his personal preferences, but a deliberate choice to make his ideas accessible to a wide audience. Calvin's work environment was simple. He lived in a house on the Rue des Chanoines in Geneva, where he had a study, a main living area, and a bedroom. He often alternated between writing by hand and dictating to a secretary. His handwriting was small and neat, but it could be hard to read for those not used to it. Calvin preferred to write letters by hand as a sign of respect to his correspondents. He only dictated letters when he was too sick to write. Despite the physical effort it took, Calvin found great value in the act of writing, believing it was a way to share his ideas clearly and effectively. John Calvin, the famous reformer, often found himself working from his bed due to his poor health. Despite his many ailments, which included migraines, tuberculosis, and gout, Calvin remained incredibly productive. His work habits were a mix of personal writing and dictation, and his home was a bustling place where friends and colleagues often visited. Calvin usually started his day very early. On days when he didn't have to preach, he would stay in bed, have books brought to him by around 5 or 6 in the morning, and begin his work. He would often dictate to a secretary who was there to help him. Even when he did have to preach, he would return home after his sermon, go back to bed, and continue working. This routine allowed him to be both comfortable and productive, despite his health issues. Sometimes, Calvin wrote in the pole, which was a small room or area where he could stay warm. In a letter to his friend William Farel in 1549, Calvin mentioned that he was writing from the pole, suggesting that he used this space for his work when he needed to stay warm. Calvin's writing process often involved using notes and quotations from other authors. He would have books brought to him so he could reference them while writing. His secretary, or sometimes a friend, would help him by taking down his dictation. This method allowed him to produce a lot of work even when he was too sick to write by hand. Calvin was known for his quick and flowing style of writing, but he also took time to revise his work. For example, when he wrote the Institutes of the Christian Religion, he made many changes over the years, often adding new sections and reorganizing the text. He worked with secretaries who would help him with these revisions, and sometimes even cut and pasted sections of the text to improve it. Preparing manuscripts for publication was a challenging task. Calvin's handwriting was often hard to read, and the texts he submitted to printers were sometimes messy. To help with this, he relied on friends and secretaries to transcribe and clean up his work. Antoine de Piner, for example, helped Calvin prepare the second edition of the Institutes by correcting and organizing the text. Despite his health problems, Calvin's output was remarkable. He managed to produce a vast amount of written work, including commentaries, sermons, and polemical writings. His ability to stay productive while dealing with illness is a testament to his dedication and the support he received from those around him. Calvin's home was not just a place of work. It was also a place where he welcomed friends and colleagues. This open environment sometimes led to distractions and even theft, but it also fostered a sense of community and collaboration. His study, though often disorganized, was a hub of intellectual activity. In the end, John Calvin's life and work show the incredible resilience and dedication of a man who, despite his many challenges, made a significant impact on the world of religion and thought. His legacy continues to influence many today, and his story is a reminder that even in the face of adversity, great things can be achieved.